This is Reddit Revenge. And here's the story you don't want to miss. When I was a child, my father was more than just a parent. He was my hero, my best friend, the kind of man you imagine you'll grow up to be. He worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs while powering through law school, and still made time to read bedtime stories and play ball with me and my siblings. On weekends, he would sketch plans for small businesses he built with his friends, then sit down for dinner with us as if he hadn't been grinding for 20 hours straight. He was living proof that sacrifice didn't have to mean absence. And then came the stomach cancer. Stage 4, unstoppable. I remember watching tubes snake in and out of him, doctors explaining memory loss, and praying he would still know me. On his last day conscious, he smiled at me, just a flicker, but enough. That smile was my proof he remembered I was his son. He slipped into a coma, woke only to say goodbye to my mother, and died soon after. Mom was a housewife with no income, terrified and grieving. We were children left in a storm, with only memories of a man who had done everything for us. That was when my grandfather stepped in. He wasn't a savior, though he liked to play the part. He was one of those self-absorbed men who sees tragedy not as a loss but as an opportunity to spotlight himself. At the funeral, he brandished the obituary like a resume, boasting to distant relatives about his dead son's grades and accolades. When Mom struggled to understand Dad's businesses, he offered to help manage them for her. In her grief and inexperience, she agreed. From then on, he positioned himself as the family's benefactor. He cut the checks, decided what we could afford, and constantly reminded us of our supposed dependence on his generosity. To outsiders, it looked like he'd stepped up as patriarch. To us, it felt like a leash, but we were too young and too vulnerable to challenge him. Mom kept food on the table with part-time jobs, while my grandfather promised he was keeping the businesses afloat. We wanted to believe him. We had no idea that behind his generous mask was a man quietly rewriting the legacy of my father into his own. The businesses under his watch became ghosts, or at least that's what he told us. Dividends were minimal, barely enough to cover scraps of tuition. Mom cycled through jobs, anything to cover groceries and electricity. Whenever the topic of money came up, Grandpa would sigh dramatically and remind us how much he was sacrificing. Meanwhile, he paraded himself to neighbors as the noble widower's father, holding the family together. He did offer to pay for our schooling, though he emphasized how burdensome it was. In reality, I scored scholarships and hustled for aid, so he barely spent on me. For my siblings, though, he painted himself as their savior, repeating the narrative until it seeped into our bones. Without him, we'd have nothing. I remember sitting through dinners where he'd list the bills he'd paid, as though we were supposed to applaud. As a kid, I swallowed it. As a teen, I started to notice cracks. Mom avoiding eye contact, whispers about company offices shrinking, and a lingering bitterness in her sighs. But still, I couldn't yet imagine the scale of betrayal that was already underway. Years passed, and by the time I graduated, the illusion had shattered. We were broke. My sister was deep into medical school, my brother still clawing through classes, and the costs were crushing us. My sister, ever pragmatic, offered to drop out. She said she could get a job, start paying bills, and relieve us all. I told her no. She was brilliant, dedicated, and deserved to graduate. We'd find a way, I promised, even though I had no clue how. That's when my grandparents turned from cold to cruel. They cut us off entirely. "We've done enough," they said. Worse, they mocked my sister's dream. My grandmother sneered, "Why waste money becoming a doctor? You'll just have children and quit." To them, my sister's ambition was foolishness, my brother's studies a burden, and my own teaching job a dead end. It was misogyny and spite wrapped in condescension. And for the first time, I began to see their help for what it was, a control tactic. They hadn't been lifting us up. They'd been keeping us under their thumb, feeding us just enough to stay dependent. I was teaching high school when the truth finally surfaced. Out of the blue, one of Dad's old business partners reached out. He asked how we were holding up, how Mom was doing. I asked him cautiously how the company was faring. His answer was a bombshell. "Your grandfather's been siphoning money for years," he said flatly. He explained how Grandpa, still holding Dad's shares on our behalf, diverted profits into his own accounts while tossing crumbs our way. The sums he pocketed dwarfed what he'd given us for school. Worse, he had taken possession of the company's original office space, forced the business into a dingy replacement, then rented the prime property to competitors under his own name. Competitors were paying him directly while our company bled. And all this time we believed his story, that the businesses were barely staying alive, that without his personal generosity, we'd be destitute. In reality, he had been cutting us off from our own inheritance, choking us into gratitude for his theft. My father had built those companies to secure our future. My grandfather had twisted them into his vanity project. The anger that hit me was volcanic. It wasn't just theft. It was betrayal of blood, a desecration of my father's memory. My siblings and I had grown up thinking we owed him thanks. In reality, we owed him nothing. He owed us everything. The image of my father working himself to the bone, building businesses in the margins of his exhaustion, just to leave us something, weighed against the image of his own father stripping it bare. It made my stomach turn. But rage alone couldn't fix it. I realized that his pride, the very arrogance he flaunted, was also his weakness. He needed to be admired, to be seen as the patriarch, the provider, the man at the top. If I could rip that away from him publicly, not just in whispers, it would break him more than lawyers or lawsuits ever could. So I started quietly pulling together a plan. I talked to Mom and my siblings, gathered signatures declaring me the representative of my father's estate. Legally, those shares were ours, not his. He'd only ever been a placeholder. I decided to take back what was always meant for us, and to humiliate him in the process. With the signatures secured, I approached the board of directors, everyone except my grandfather. Calmly, I explained that I was now the sole representative of my late father's estate. My grandfather had styled himself as chairman for years, but it was only by virtue of those shares. The board, tired of his interference and greedy games, saw reason. They recognized me as the rightful representative and, by extension, the true chairman. I made it clear I didn't intend to cling to the title forever. I was a teacher, not a businessman. But I wanted the company my father built to finally be in safe hands. Meanwhile, I began to shine light on my grandfather's side hustle, renting the company's original office to competitors. I spoke to extended family, laying out the facts, and the shame hit him harder than any lawsuit. Under pressure, he evicted our rivals and forced them out. For the first time, the man who strutted as a savior was on the defensive, scrambling to explain. And I wasn't finished. The next board meeting was already scheduled. I knew exactly how I would end this charade, and the stage was set for the confrontation I dreamed about for years. The boardroom was polished wood and glass, a place where my grandfather had puffed his chest for decades. That day, when he entered, the scene was different. The directors were already seated, their eyes fixed on the head chair turned away from the table. He marched forward, prepared to preside as always. But as he approached, I spun the chair slowly around. It was me sitting there. For a moment, the air was pure silence, like the intake before thunder. His eyes widened, the mask cracking, and I said the words I'd been waiting to deliver. The company and our family no longer need you. From this day forward, I represent my father's estate. His voice faltered. Do you know that I'm the one who put you and your siblings through school? I met his gaze, calm and cold. No, Dad did. The boardroom seemed to tilt. Years of his arrogance collapsed in that instant. He looked small, embarrassed, stripped of the one thing he had clung to, pride. And for the first time in my life, I saw him defeated. I didn't keep the crown. After the meeting, I stepped down from the chairman's role. My goal was never to seize power, but to restore fairness. I accepted a humble position in the Treasury Department as a bookkeeper, earning modestly but honestly. More importantly, I ensured that any dividends or profits from the company went where my father intended, to his family, to support our futures. One of my first motions as a board member before stepping down was the sweetest of all. I secured my mother a permanent position in the company. After years of scraping together work while being patronized by her father-in-law, she now had stability and respect. Watching her walk into her new office, head held high, was a victory worth more than any title. The empire my father had built was no longer siphoned off by a parasite. It was serving the family again, and I could finally breathe, knowing I had honored Dad's memory not with words but with action. My grandfather, stripped of power, drifted into irrelevance. Jobless, he spent his days wandering his house like a ghost, clinging to memories of authority that no longer existed. He had spent his life manipulating people into seeing him as indispensable, but without his seat at the table, he had nothing. Friends? He had none. He'd burned those bridges long ago. Family? Even my grandmother, who once supported his chauvinism, had grown tired of his bitterness. They stopped sleeping in the same room, and her disdain became open. All he had left were his boasts, but no one cared to listen. The man who had fed on control now sat powerless, stripped of the illusion that sustained him. It was the punishment he feared most, irrelevance. He had stolen our money, our security, and our futures, but in the end he couldn't steal dignity. That belonged to my father, and now it belonged to us. In the months that followed, fragments of his hypocrisy continued to surface. My sister discovered that he had siphoned what little remained of his savings into the pockets of a sugar baby. It was almost laughable, a final, desperate attempt to buy admiration, the very thing he'd always craved. Instead, it only deepened his misery. His wife turned on him, furious at his betrayal. Whatever sympathy lingered evaporated. He was left with nothing. No career, no respect, no family loyalty, and not even the illusion of devotion at home. Karma had a way of catching up with him, and in his case it was brutal. He could have chosen compassion. He could have lived as the grandfather who uplifted his son's family. Instead, he lived long enough to watch every mask slip, every lie unravel, until he was just a bitter old man staring at four walls, stewing in regret. And as cruel as it sounds, I couldn't imagine a fate more fitting for him. For me, the path forward was quieter but truer. I returned to teaching, still working at the company on the side, and watched my siblings graduate into the careers our father always dreamed for us. My sister donned her white coat. My brother began his residency. Mom smiled more than she cried. And every time I walked past the office building Dad had built, I felt a sense of peace. The revenge wasn't about money or power, it was about reclaiming what he wanted for us. In the end, I went from teacher to chairman and back again, not for ambition but for justice. And I'd do it all again if it meant protecting the legacy of the man who gave everything for his family. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him earlier, or waited for the perfect strike? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'll be reading. If the story struck you, hit like so more people see it, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. And share this video with someone who knows what it feels like to fight for family. Thanks for watching, and remember, true revenge is restoring what was stolen.